In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a deep house and organic house style bass and how to achieve that extremely warm sound that the All Day I Dream tracks usually tend to have. So we're gonna break this down in 3 simple steps. The first will be a nice, warm, full sounding bass line. The second is going to have a little bit of movement on that bass line to sound even more professional. And the third is going to be adding width and some stereo imaging to that bass line to make it sound really big and full. We're only using Wavetable and stock plugins, nothing fancy. So let's jump into it, but before we do, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn your notifications on, and you'll get more videos like this one. I have this compressor that's sidechain compressing from the kick, and that is the only effects I have on here except for the EQ, which we'll be using in a second. Let's go to Wavetable and drop that into the bass channel. I'm going to turn my second oscillator on and also push that down 1 full octave. So now we have a oscillator, 1 lower octave, so we have 2 bass frequencies here. It already sounds pretty good because we do have the 2 bass frequencies, the lower sub, and then that mid-level bass frequency. So that's already going to make it feel much fuller. We're going to actually add some warmth to this, and we're going to do this in 2 different ways. First is going to be by changing the waveform of the oscillator in our bass line. So we're going to change this sine wave into something that carries overtones. Overtones is a fancy way of essentially saying that we're adding frequencies to the original sound. So let's move this up and we'll just solo the bass and we'll obviously hear more frequency content coming through. It's going to be much grittier. I'm going to go all the way to the square wave and then back to the sawtooth. So my favorite is the sawtooth. Let me duplicate the bass so we have the original, and then let's go in and change this second bass to be more warm. We're going to actually filter out almost all of that harmonic content. All those overtones, those extra frequencies. Okay, right about there. So we're getting a lot more of a full sound. We're adding all these octaves and harmonies, and then we're cutting almost all of them out so that we're still getting just a little bit of them, but we're cutting so much of it out that it doesn't sound very high end. Even just grabbing these extra octaves and harmonies here, we are adding a lot of power and warmth and presence to the bass. Let's listen before and after. And that might still be a little bit too crunchy, so we can change this to a ×4 and hear how that sounds. Maybe back it off a bit. So much warmer now. Let's listen in the context of the mix. It definitely feels warmer and more present. The second way that we can do this is by adding something called a saturator. So let's just go to this OG bass, we'll duplicate that over again, and we'll name this saturated bass. And we'll name this one the saw warm bass. So the saturated bass, we still have the 2 octaves here. Let's grab a saturator and throw that on. And the same idea as before, we're going to put the saturator before the EQ. That's very important because we don't want to saturate after our EQing because we want to cut out the high end. So let's pull this over here. We'll turn off the EQ filter for now and take a listen to what's actually happening when we increase the saturator drive. And you can see here as well, we're adding more frequencies. So this will sound a little bit different than the sawtooth wave. And then we can filter out the high end again. So they both sound different, but they're both warm in their own regards. Let's take a listen to the sawtooth warm bass versus the saturated bass. They're both pretty warm and full sounding, but they do sound pretty different. Let's move on to the second part of this, where we're going to give the bass a bit of movement to sound more professional. We'll get rid of the saturated bass. We'll only use this sawtooth warm style bass. I'm going to turn off my filter inside of the EQ, and I'm going to change the filtering into the actual wavetable. So I'll change this to 24, and I'll put this down to 150, which is right about where we were filtering out before. And let's take a listen to make sure that it sounds very similar to where we were with the EQ filter. You can see that we're still cutting off all that high frequency on a very sharp slope, and that's what we want. We want the warmth from the high frequencies, but we don't want the crunchiness or the crispiness, just that nice warm sound. So let's actually bring this down maybe to 135. And we're going to change the top end of the frequency with some movement from an LFO. I'm going to grab my LFO here, change the amount to maybe 30 or 40%, and I want to turn the retrigger off. The retrigger is going to reset the parameter to the beginning of the LFO every time a note is played, and I don't want that. I want it to flow through the LFO the whole time. Go back to my matrix, click on frequency, and turn up LFO 1, maybe 10 or 15. And let's hear how it sounds now. You can see that the filter is opening and closing. Let's push it up a little bit more. We can really hear what's going on now. Let's bring this down so that it's just opening it a little bit. And let's turn the rate down a little. And we'll turn the amount down even more. Maybe we'll put 15. It's very subtle, but it's adding a bit of depth to the sound by opening and closing it. And it's just gonna make it sound a little bit more interesting, even subconsciously. So we're gonna take this another step forward into the third technique, which is going to be actually adding some width to the bass. And I know this sounds bad because we don't want to be adding width to our basses, but there is a way that we can do it, and it's going to sound really cool. So let's duplicate this saw warm bass. It's duplicated, and we're going to name this one wide bass. So on this channel here, I'm going to go into here and open up this frequency just a little bit more. We'll keep the movement on there, and let's take a listen. I'm going to turn off the first oscillator here. I don't need that sub frequency anymore. And let's push this up an octave. Frequency's at around 265. We can push the resonance up a little bit as well. And maybe the frequency we can bring up to 280. Now what I'm going to do is actually add a bunch of stereo width to this sound and make it sound pretty interesting. So we'll put the classic unison on, and we'll have the amount around 25. Let's even push the voices up a little bit. Let's change our amp so that the attack is just slightly slower, around 50 milliseconds, and the release is longer. 1.18 seconds. And let's put that LFO on our wavetable position as well. I'm going to push the oscillator 2 position up quite a bit, and this is going to change the wavetable position from the square to the saw to the triangle and back, and just give a bit more movement. Maybe we'll bring the frequency up a little bit more, and we're going to cut out that low frequency. Let's add some chorus to this. And we're also going to add some reverb, which is like, I know there's some people that are ready to write in the comments telling me that this is a terrible idea, but just wait. We're going to push the output up because it's a little quiet. We're going to push the warmth all the way to 100. The feedback will push up, and the dry wet will push all the way up. This is going to be a very wide sound. Decay time we can push up just a little bit, and the dry wet we can bring down just a little bit. This is the most important step of all of this, and that is going to be mid-side EQ. We're going to be cutting out the stereo image. So we're going to be removing from the low end the image that could cause problems with a wider bass. So that is what's going to save this from being a disaster if we were to play this in mono. With this EQ, I'm going to put it to mid-side and change this from mid to side mode and cut out all the low frequencies up to around 250, 300. So now we're removing a lot of the wide sounds. We're still getting that really cool phasey echo type sound, but we're not in stereo for anything really below the 200 to 300 mark, which is where the problem areas really start to come through with basses. So I want to push this high end up even more. We could even put an auto pan on here if we wanted, with just a slight amount of movement. And maybe we can turn the volume up just a little bit. And let's double check with the utility that we're not ruining this sound. Let's check in mono. So even in mono, it still sounds pretty cool. We're not losing a bunch of sound due to phase cancellation. Let's take a listen now. The original bass, then the saw warm bass, and then with this additional wide bass on top. So it's actually really simple to get that really nice full analog warmth at the bottom end of the track. You just have to make sure that you're adding a bit of saturation and filtering out any unwanted high-end frequency to get that nice warmth that they have in the All Day I Dream style tracks. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and I will see you in the next video.